Dr. Hans Utter. Welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for part 4 of our continuing series on music, mind control, and psychobiology. And ladies and gentlemen, we have some really good stuff today. Hans has been doing a lot of research over the last couple of weeks, and we've actually decided to probably add a part 5 to this series as well, and maybe some even more. Who knows? It keeps going on, and I've also located some more material that I am working to get out to Princeton to go gather. So anyway, Hans, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. And definitely appreciate people who have been watching the series. And it's really nice to kind of share this information and actually take it to a deeper level as well for myself. So that's been pretty interesting, especially because with ethnomusicology, I'm used to analyzing different societies and cultures, and I'm not part of it all. So I'll look at the entire social structure and things like that. And when I approached this, I just did it. I basically just looked at this kind of objectively, even though, of course, there's going to be my own personal experiences, but just trying to go through and put all these things together. And even if some material has come to light that may be disturbing or not fit, just kind of look at it as you do it as scientific, anthropological study of another culture. So that's great. And just want to tell the audience too that I am going to be trying to do some further research here. So on my website, or maybe add a donate button, not to be out there proselytizing, but certainly would appreciate it, because this research is something that I think is very important to get out, but also it's something that can affect your relationship, so to speak, to the society at large. So it's, remaining independent is important. So, anyways.
Indeed it is. And your work in ethnomusicology, similar to my work in ethnobotany and ethnomycology, we've both sort of taken it from studying other cultures to studying how our own cultures use these things for these same tactics, and actually have taken the practice of using these things for mind control to much further extremes than indigenous cultures or foreign cultures have.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point, because, to be honest, the things that I've been uncovering, I almost wanted to stop. I said, this is too much. But the thing is now there's a chain of evidence that I'm establishing, and a chain of associations and evolution that is much more than I thought it was. But the cool thing about it is that, again, approaching it with sort of the methodology, if you look at another culture, if you're examining another culture, you're not going to, unless you've identified with them or you have a particular agenda, you're not going, if you see a practice, you're going to say, well, here's the practice. What does this entail? How does this fit into their history, their social structures, all the other relational elements, mythology, environment, everything, economic structures. And so you look at that, and similar to this, these series. So it's been really, really cool to kind of have this dialogue. And also, as an aside, one reason I'm doing the Indian music is to show, when I'll go into some certain things today that may be a little sort of outside the purview, you'd say, of rationalism or science, it's important to understand that, number one, many powerful people believe in this stuff or employ it. Now, it's quite possible there's another level behind that, which I'm getting into, which we won't go into today. But the fact is that we'll talk about relationship of some of these you could call more spiritual or religious, categories, a categorization of sound based on a different model. And the thing is, at least with this particular topic we're looking at today, if you say you could Ledbetter and Annie Besant's book on chemistry, but it's chemistry based on this alchemical model. So it's very much scientific. They have all these charts of elements, but it also is connected with this quote unquote esoteric level. And just one thing to note also that a lot of these things, like say practices of yoga, Kundalini, and all these things are phenomena or things. But the big thing I noticed, mostly when this is being imported, it's being imported in a very incomplete way. It's being utilized for a different purpose. And so even, certain practices, right? If you do yoga, you're going to feel great. Now, if while you're doing yoga, you are also, listening to certain types of sounds or being indoctrinated into a particular culture, then this experiential empowerment, so to speak, you're doing yoga, you're actually being brought into something else. So that means that even something that has a positive effect can be linked with something else, right? And that goes on the macro level to mass social movements, on also the micro level to an individual song or even a word or a gesture, right? But yeah, so it's going to be quite interesting, I think, hopefully for everybody, myself as well.
All right, so where do we begin?
All right, well, I thought I'd give a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So first thing, I'm going to do a demonstration of Indian music, Indian classical music, and talk about that. And then we'll look at a bit of this, the chakras and electromagnetic body, electromagnetic fields around the body, and how just a little bit behind that, how that relates to music and resonance. Then I'll look a little bit at the ritual process in a more anthropological sense. And then I'll dive into one of those topics that we all kind of want to avoid or will gloss over or look at it in a superficial level, or also look at it in a way that's conditioned by a particular belief system that will block out certain information. So look for evidence in rock, occult and rock music. I'll hopefully get into a whole bunch of other things and some new material I've discovered. But I think this should be pretty comprehensive in terms of giving a larger picture and expanding what we've done before. And I do want to stress that the original, those 8 categories I did in the first interview, we'll probably go back to those again because those are still employed and implicit in everything I'm talking about. But I'll probably review that a little bit later. But okay, well, go ahead and get started here in describing Indian music. So Indian classical music is certainly most well known for its impact in the 1960s and the association with various gurus, with Brian Jones or George Harrison, lots of other musicians. But the fact is that Indian classical music, well, I'm sure that I do get some gigs here and there from and there's a lot of people that are attracted to the sitar by the Beatles. I actually wasn't attracted by the Beatles per se, but more just a desire, honestly, to get out of the music performance scene I was in, because I was playing a lot of jazz, which was good, but I was also associated, like kind of jam band scene, a lot of this, or proto jam band scene. So that whole culture started to get to me, so to speak. So I decided to go to India and study the music and language and culture there. And so Indian classical music has a history going back, you'd say, there's various terms or records, but at least 1000 BC, approximately, maybe a bit later. That's the roots of it. And this music actually was derived, or one of the origins was that of the Sanskrit chanting. And I'll talk a little bit about the Sanskrit language later. But Sanskrit Vedic chanting, Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pustivaranam Avokamiva So that was basically these simple patterns, but they're associated with these very long, extensive texts. And from that, beginnings of scales and modes began to develop. There's a stone dating around the time of the Emperor Ashoka, around 1000 BC approximately, and that has a bunch of musical notation. But as it developed in India, You have an impact of both uh, music from the Middle East or Central Asia, Persian, Bukhara, present-day Tajikistan, uh, things like that. And the music itself is, you could say, based on scientific principles, at least within the framework of particular cosmology. You can, again, find similar things in the Middle Ages, etc. But the music itself, developed through the marriage of different cultures, but also a particular placement for music in society, sort of recognizing in a way, if you look at Plato, how music is developed, how music is informed, what are the deeper roots of music. And so music, again, being something, this is it's a sound of vibrations. So we hear notes, we hear songs, we hear melodies, we hear rhythm. Fundamentally, it's all vibratory. It's, these are waves of sound, right, that hit your ear. So Jan, if you want to right now, go ahead and play that timbre demo that I sent you.
We will hear a voice, clarinet, and erhu, each with its full harmonic spectrum playing the same pitch. Next, we will hear the same set of sounds with the second, third, fourth, and fifth partials filtered out. Now we will hear the voice in two instruments with all harmonics filtered out, leaving only the fundamental A440. We conclude with the original sounds.
I noticed a few YouTube comments about timbre, so this should hopefully clarify it, where you have all these different instruments reduced as you use filters and take out different levels of the overtone series or harmonic partials. You come down to a sine wave. But Indian music is really based on the overtone series. And I want to make just a brief aside also on classical music versus folk music or popular music. It's a differentiation I probably should have done in the beginning. But when we talk about quote unquote popular music as opposed to classical music, there's two fundamental differences. One of them being that a classical form of music, generally speaking, has an accompanying body of texts, either written or oral. It is usually connected with some type of sponsorship, in that to maintain a complex tradition that is something that will not necessarily appeal to the masses, so to speak, then it requires some type of support or sponsorship. And sometimes this can be through, if it's, say in Bali, the music is part of the religious practices, and it's also part of the village structure. Or in India, as in the West, you have a system of patronage by nobles, royalty, feudal people. In the present day, you have, business magnates, not so much, but, but various people like that. And the fact is that, in India, before the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, there was a very amalgamated culture, a very highly developed world. And that was that was brought down. Basically, the Seaport Mutiny was the end of that. But this process, in terms of creating a divide and rule, in terms of rewriting the history of the music based on several agendas. And one of the biggest things was you had a Urdu culture, a Persianate or sort of Islamic culture that was fused with the local Indian culture. And then you had the desire, they set up particular schools to teach people English, and they began to look to create a split between Muslim and Hindu populations, which were very well integrated. And that split is, you can see right around you today. If you want to see a lot of the problems in the world, at least in that region, you can, especially India, especially right now, directly coming from that. And music was certainly a part of that. And so anyways, let me just dive in here. And so this is sitar, and sitar is probably pretty well known. Everyone's probably seen this before. And this is an instrument, again, that sort of became an emblem of the hippies. I remember getting pretty mad when a jazz guy, heavy jazz guy, I met someone else I knew, and he's like, oh, I play sitar. He's like, oh, having fun with those Beatles songs? And I was like, I got kind of annoyed with that because, the Beatles, well, bringing sitar and popularizing it it's a very ornate and complex art. So in the background, you hear a sound, and this is a tambora, known as a drone. And this particular timbre is very buzzy. It's very rich in overtones. And I'm tuned to A432 for better or worse. And so anyways, I got some more to add about that later. But so within this, I'm basically creating a field of spectra, right? Sound partials, but also creating a resonance between my body and the sound, which continues, right? So this is a type of drone music. There's lots of genres that employ drones. But one thing about using a drone or a fixed tonic is that you can play the actual notes that are in tune, meaning that anytime you play a piano or any type of fretted instrument, the scale has been tempered, which means that each half step, which is a small interval, right? The octave is divided into 12 steps. But as soon as I start playing in different keys, these notes are going to go out of tune. And so you have to find a way to maintain the actual integrity of the notes, but still being able to play in different keys. So basically, they don't all quite line up, and instead you take all the pieces and cut them into intervals of 100 cents, right? So anyways, so in indie music, you can actually play a whole range of microtonal things like that. And so this drone is also resonance, right? So when you hear the drone, drone creates sort of a relational field between yourself and the sound that's experienced, inside your body as you listen. And also within the sound, it's playing two notes of the scale, the tonic and the fifth. But because of the overtones, you can actually hear all different notes in there. You can hear the third, the fifth, seventh. Actually, in a sense, this creates a resonant field that the notes of the instrument or voice will meld with. So, and basically Indian music has the melodic form. Well, let me go ahead and play a bit, and I'll talk about it.
I should mention again that any distortion is from Skype as well.
that was an example of an alap. What I was playing there is what's known as a raga. So Indian music has over 1,200 ragas. And a raga is, you could say, kind of like a scale, like a melody. But more than that, it is considered to be, well, the meaning of raga means that which colors the mind. So the raga is sort of a combination of sounds to evoke particular emotions, particular states, experiential states, and things like that. But it's also very much music based on a lot of order. So it's not like I just play and I'm jamming out, but there's a whole very, very complex structure going on there. But at the same time, once that's internalized, then it's actually possible to sort of play, just as if you're making a painting. And if you've mastered all the techniques of painting, you can go and just be creative without worrying about all these rules, so to speak, when you're doing it. But basically, ragas are assigned to different times of the day. So there's ragas for the evening, for the morning, late evening, late afternoon, things like that. And the ragas are based on this, the Ayurvedic medical system of India, which says that your body or your emotions actually changes throughout the day. So however you want to define why that's occurring, there's certain types of melodies that are more conducive, that are better for you at different types of the day, or will have more of an impact. And there's also seasonal ragas. So for example, there's a monsoon rag called Meg. But there's literally thousands of these ragas. And you can find various treatises about how it affects different organs of the body, things like that. It can actually be used for healing as well. But in Indian music, again, you have this, what I wanted to stress also, being a classical music, it does require, you can go into, you would call probably non-ordinary states listening to it. But at the same time, there's also this intellectual component or an understanding component, right? So these are both kind of intermingled. So I'll just play a little bit of I'll just play like a little composition, and this will be in a tala 16-beat rhythmic cycle. Utpola, I'm gonna do something in a second here. Yeah, just in 3 minutes. So here's an example of a composition. Wait, Utpola, can you? This is my wife, Jan.
Hi.
Hello.
Why don't you sit there? You sit there and then you can sing a little bit. Beto, okay. Okay. So I'm going to play an example of a composition. And in Indian music, it doesn't use a linear time cycle. So if you have a rock beat, right? It's going from a beginning point to an end point, but it's also on a linear time grid, which means that it has a beginning point and it's divided into measures, units of 4 notes. Indian music is divided into sort of much larger, or can be much larger, depending on the tempo, but these are units of musical time. So in this case, I'm using a 16-beat tala. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 1. So that's a unit, but it also circles around. So it gives you a very different psychological effect, and it actually requires certainly to develop certain types of cognitive or perceptual abilities, to play it, which are necessarily, I would say, are not aided by taking psychedelics, or can be perhaps. But anyway, so I'm going to play a composition. Do a few improvisations. that's just an example sort of a composition, improvise with it, but many complex substructures, but also certainly based on an understanding of music's impact. And so there's a very important thing about the purity of the note. And one reason I like this music, it's very stripped down. You really just have the notes and you've got almost the most pure elements with which to construct things. So you don't have huge retinues of sound or flashing lights unless maybe next year I'll be doing that, but not right now. So anyways, we're going to have just a brief, the vocal music is actually the core of Indian classical music. So Borah is going to demonstrate just a few things about singing and how that relates to the body.
All right. You're just cutting out pretty badly there for a moment, but go ahead.
So Indian music, Indian classical music I'm talking about, there are two major system in Indian classical music is Northern Indian, which is called Hindustani classical music. That's the Northern India, not only India, but it also spreads out to Pakistan, Afghanistan, even for Bangladesh too, because it was before India divided, like it was a kind of concept was when it was Greater India, and that is called Hindustani or Northern Indian classical music, and then the other system is Southern or Carnatic music, which is only the 4 states in the Southern India, that is Andhra Pradesh, Trivandrum, and then Chennai and Karnataka. Okay, so now in Hindustani music, Northern Indian or Hindustani music, classical music, we call the Sangeet, which is a word which says it has Geet, Vadya, and Nritya. Nritya means, the Geet means the singing, Vadya means any playing instrument, and the third is the Natya or Nritya, that is dance or Abhinay or acting. It can be because both dance and as well as acting, so singing. So this all combines the music. Music means all three together. So performing arts. So now I'll talk about a little bit about singing, because that's the core of all three elements. It's there in all of them. So I'll just sing a rag again. Hans will explain, and he already explained what is rag. So the rag are according to the time and the season. In India, we have 6 seasons. Like here, you say 4 seasons, we have 6 seasons. Again, like it starts with spring, monsoon, autumn, and so forth. So, and the rag, there are 6 major rag which are according to the 6th season. They're like Vasant and Malhar and so forth. And the time, the 24 hours, the time, the day has been divided all the ragas are kind of designed according to the time. So currently, what is the time now? Around 2 o'clock?
12 o'clock.
Yeah, it's 1:30 our time. So it's around for what? Say any afternoon's rag. So I'll sing a rag. It's afternoon rag again called Vrindavani Sarang. Okay, just a note and a little bit of composition. So, what's the song?
Not too loud.
Is it too loud or is it okay?
Yeah, it's a little bit too loud there.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Ni sa ga ma pa ni sa sa ni da pa ma ga re sa. So these are our notes, basic note. So this composition is it's a very traditional composition. It's again in medium and fast tempo, 16-beat rhythmic cycle, what Hans told about. So it ja jari apni mandirava ja jari apni mandirava sun paavoge sasan nadi जा जा रे अपने मंदिरवा जा जा रे अपने मंदिरवा सुनहो सदा रंग तुमको चाहत है सुनहो सदा रंग तुमको चाहत है क्या तुमको सगन दिया जा जा रे अपने मंदिरवा जा जा रे अपने मंदिर. So this is the composition. This says that kind of it's what I can say. It's like kind of a devotional, yeah, saying that please go to the temple and pray. It's.
Can you turn down the tone a little bit just so I can hear you a little better?
Yeah.
You just
Thank
turn
you.
off.
I'll turn it. So it says. It says. Go to the temple. Ja ja. Go to the temple. Temple also means temple in the heart. That also means that it has the multiple meaning, and it's just basically a spiritual message, talking about going to temple and kind of praying to God in, I guess, both way you can put it together, either a spiritual or physically going to the temple and that's the meaning. Thank you. Yeah, so that's how we kind of, this is a pure classical, and then we have several other, then we have semi-classical, which are is more like a musical theater, you can say, because that's it's again the lyrics are always, the text are been most of, we have the it's called thumri, which is a very important because it's again links with the popularized by the courtesans. Courtesans were the dancing or the singing girl, but they are like very high level. I mean, because they used to serve the nobles and the king or wherever. I think Hans can give you more, and they were also done. It's a form, a classical dance form called Kathak. They used to perform together. Often they used to know both, or sometimes they only sing. And so here they are the one who actually popularized it. The Thumris, again, the lyrics are very simple. It's always the love, separation, this kind of thing. The woman is always kind of portraying that. They, again, the rags which have been used for this are like, we call it, they're like, they're classical rag, but they're more mixed with several other. And then the compositions are like I'll tell you, like, Jao balam nahi bolo, like, go my beloved, don't talk to me. So she's kind of annoyed because he did not come. He was spending the night with another woman. So it's very simple, but the way it's the appeal, how she's kind of trying to say in different, that's one line, often one or two line, or maybe three lines. It's just kind of saying in different way. I'm trying to tell him, like, go, don't come, but she also wants him to come. So it's kind of a musical theater. So these are, and then again, here you have different other types we call it Sawan, Jula. These are like songs according to 12 months, like 12, the seasonal songs. They are also been called semi-classical. During now, monsoon is very important in India now. So lots of monsoon songs which are also sung, called as a also been uplifted as been taken as a semi-classical form. So it's various other like that. Shall I show? Yeah. So the Thumri, I'll just tell you, right, appropriate for now because it's a monsoon. So there's a rag called Mishra Pilu. The Pilu is a rag, and Mishra Pilu takes all 12 notes. All 12 notes are here. And this song, particularly, Aja Huna Aaye, Hamar Aja Huna Aaye Hamare Saiya, Jiya nahi lage ka karu guiya. Means my beloved Ajahuna, he hasn't come so far. He didn't come. What do I do, my friend? So also another thing, because see, this is exact from the northern India place, especially the Pura, Uttar Pradesh or Banaras. That is the place from where these songs are from. So the ladies are always they're always they're always at home, because their husband are away. They work in the city or elsewhere. They don't come sometime for months, sometime for years. And especially in monsoon, because that's so important for us, because agriculture is the most important, and it's also fertility. Everything relates. So she's talking to her, telling her friends, see, I miss him. It's monsoon and he's not here. Okay, so this is like, sorry. Hamar Saiya Ajhun Aaye Hamar Saiya. Saiya means beloved. Jiya nahi lage main ka karu guiya. Jia, my heart is not here. I don't know what to do. Jia nahi lage, Jia nahi lage, Jia nahi lage main ka karu guiya. Ajhun aaye hamar saiya. That's it. So you can just go on and on, because she'll describe about the monsoon, how the monsoon is, how the raindrops are falling. So all kind of things will come in the song, but at the same time she's explaining how sad she is. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
See you later. Yeah.
All for bringing coffee. No, but so yeah, hopefully that gave you guys a bit more understanding about Indian music, and it's very much connected with something called Nad Yoga or Sound Yoga, and Nad Yoga uses sound as a way for, well, it depends on what your objective in yoga is, but basically it's a practice that's sort of known as a sadhana. Sadhana means bringing together mind, body, and heart. So you're using your mind, your body, and your heart, all these three components, to properly do a sadhana. So Nad Yoga is based on an understanding, vibratory sort of understanding of the universe, and that's certainly coming out now with modern science. I have an interesting article by Colonel Thomas L. Bearden where he goes into quite great detail about this whole understanding of these processes, which were understood to a greater or lesser extent and not put into scientific language, but you could say more spiritual language, but in fact they relate to very distinct physiological processes. So anyways, with Nad Yoga, the point is to entrain yourself and use both inner and outer hearing. And I'm just showing this to people just as something you can do. The reason I'm kind of doing this also is when we get into this other stuff, it's pretty heavy, so it's nice to have a little positive thing to do. So just a couple simple things you can do. This is one thing. If you just put your left hand over your belly button and your right hand in between your chest here, like there's this soft points that go in, and just move it around in circles. And what that actually does is it's kind of resetting your brain. That means it kind of clears the mind, so to speak, because you're activating like 3 different systems at the same time. So that's a nice little thing to do. Just, if sometimes if you get in sort of a loop, right? And a lot of this conditioning process is based sort of on these loops, so to speak. One other thing, this is actually from yoga, not yoga specifically. This is called B sound pranayama. And this is basically learning to hear your inner sound. And so it looks a little bit funny, but you can hold both ears, or you can also close your ears, eyes, and nostrils. But basically you close your eyes and hum a low hum. You can feel that vibrating your brain, actually. You do that several times, and then you can kind of listen to your inner sound. And then you know what? You do feel very good. And it also, and again, this is something that's working. You're vibrating your brain, so to speak, and you're using this resonant frequency of the body to kind of sort of like as a healing or a reset. So I'll do this just once. Maybe you want to try also.
I'll watch you do it.
Okay, so basically I'm just gonna, do this here. And so I feel much more relaxed just after doing that.
Interesting.
Yeah, cool. And
I'm sure I'll be trying that during the editing.
Yeah, no, it does help. And this one other thing you can do quickly, you just go over your ears, pressure points. And these are actually based on mind-body literature from education, not the Nada Yoga. But these are good things to do to sort of pull yourself out of things, or also, just feel better. But, especially when we see how these things are being used against us, it's good to know how to use some of these things for you. And that's right. What I feel that, Indian music is. But anyways, there's also something known as the chakras. I'm sure people are familiar with that, which are, up and down the spine. And so the chakras are connected with different glands, like the third eye is the pineal gland, things like that. And basically the chakras do have parallels in terms of neural anatomy, physical anatomy, and things like that. And even there are 5 basic resonant frequencies of the brain, primary, things like that. And they're also connected with that. So the chakras, as again, we're looking at sort of like a science, but it's not using scientific language. But now it does correlate with science, and I can give some links to a bunch of studies on this, etc. But the point that I'm getting to is this idea of Kundalini. Kundalini, this may sound pretty far out.
Well, and what is the other term for Kundalini energy would be serpent energy. So that would actually, could play right into the other side of what we've been exposing here.
Actually, it's going to. That's why I'm
okay.
Yeah, it's going to tie in very directly. But so the Kundalini is a process of, the Kundalini is an energy. They say usually assigned with the sexual center at the Swadhisthana chakra, which is the second chakra. But Kundalini is a type of you could say psycho-spiritual energy, but the fact is that Kundalini there is something that happens in the body physiologically, and there are activation of different experiences. And so the raising of this Kundalini, what we're calling Kundalini, which could be an electromagnetic energy, bioelectric energy, whatever, but there's thousands of yoga practices for raising the Kundalini. Many people experimenting with psychedelic drugs got into Kundalini yoga and all these things. And I will say, from my own knowledge and experience, Kundalini is certainly a real phenomena. Okay, and again, it's that. But the thing about Kundalini needs to be understood, and I'll talk about Tantra just briefly too. But the idea of raising the Kundalini, right? So there's all kinds of practices to raise the Kundalini. And this gives you sort of ecstatic states. You can have out of body experiences, all kinds of things. Supposedly, when the Kundalini reaches a certain level, you can develop clairvoyance, clairaudience, sort of psychic ability. But basically, Kundalini, I've seen like Kundalini yoga classes. I mean, in India, Kundalini is considered to be very dangerous, right? In traditional Tantra, which I'll clarify too. because that's another very, very misunderstood.
Well, yeah, and that's interesting. If it's taboo in India, why is it promoted as the latest new age thing in the U.S.?
Well, it's not. First of all, we understood by taboo in that Kundalini is akin to working with extremely high voltage electricity. In that, if unless you know what you're doing and you're going to go work on a power line or something, you're going to have training and you're going to be very clear about what you're doing, and you're not just going to reach up and grab that power line or randomly try to do that. Or we'll get in, this really ties in with everything you'll see here in a bit. But so the Kundalini, yeah, it's something though it was kept secret, so to speak, these practices. There's different ways, if you have a very intense emotional experience, you can feel like sort of the heart center or something like that if you've ever been in love. So that's say could be like a type of Kundalini, because Kundalini really is sort of the sort of emotional, but also the energetic drives of our body as well. So not just neurological, but also biological related to, et cetera. So, but raising the Kundalini is done through a lot of different things, a lot of different means of raising the Kundalini. But Tantra is another thing. Tantra is a very extremely complex system of philosophy. It's an it's not just, let's go out and just, sit and rub oil on each other and, whatever, or it's not also a means of indulgence. Okay. It is extremely, complex in terms of its cosmology. I mean, if you try to go through Kashmir Shaivism, it's as hard as, extremely complex physics or something. It's not a simple subject, but it's also very closely correlated with this idea of word as power or sound as power. So you have mantras, which are based off the Sanskrit language. So Kundalini is, or Kundalini yoga, or raising the Kundalini is something that's based on basically going inside your own body, mind, physiology, and amping up the power and actually freeing that energy. And so this, these practices are something that, again, they were kept secret. Because there's a guy named Gopi Krishna, who was a great Indian writer and a philosopher, and he started having these Kundalini awakening experiences, and he almost went insane, right? And he did, at brief times, go insane. But so these rituals, which I'll talk about briefly too, it's very important to understand the ritual process and what that is, as well as these types of exercises, because the fact is that the Kundalini in itself is neither good or bad, but Kundalini, again, is something that in order to do that, an actual tantric practice is, this is like a lifetime thing, and you really have to be able to take this energy. It's possible to get experiences, whether by taking entheogens or other things like that emulate it. But if you don't have the base, and especially you can become extremely manipulable, right? If your mind is not conscious. And so, but this is something we see very directly in rock, talking about awakening the Kundalini. Ray Manzarek talks about this, and we'll get into how this ties into all these Rosicrucian orders, Rudolf Steiner's eurythmics. This goes into all kinds of stuff. But it's important to say that there is some type of real phenomena that can occur. It is something, though, again, that you don't necessarily, in India, you would not do it unless you have this extremely pure diet. You maybe take several years of preparation work and things like that, because otherwise it's not something to play around with, right? It's not, but it's there. I mean, and I would certainly say that it's a real phenomena. And just briefly about Tantra. So Tantra, most people think Tantra is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, actually, Tantric practices are based on using like the breaking of the 5 transgressions are small, little symbolic, a little piece of meat, a tiny glass of wine, so the fish, so you're taking these transgressions, but it's done in a ceremony. And so there is something to be said, for this transgressive energy that you get, so to speak. But the 5 Ks, the 5 forbidden fruits, and there can be some types of sort of sexual yoga or sexual magic associated with Tantra. But even in India, there's many cases of where Tantra has run amok. There's all kinds of cults, or there's tantrics that, they do, very nefarious things. But the basics, the real tantra, the actual premise of tantra is this sort of awakening and sort of an integration of mind and body. But again, these are things that tantra doesn't mean, if you're doing this in an extremely complex ritual setting where you're taking these little tinctures as opposed to just, waking up in the morning, with 2 ounces of cocaine, like Aleister Crowley or something. That's a very different thing. But both, we see there is this some factor, and this is very much tied when we get into the occult. So before I switch rooms, I'll just briefly go into the ritual process. And so the ritual process was, Van Gennep was a Dutch anthropologist that kind of came up with this, looking at all different kinds of ceremonies around the world. And the ritual process has been found to be ubiquitous in all human societies. And what a ritual is generally speaking a fixed or repeated set of actions or set of experiences that take the individual from one stage of life to another, from one experience of life to another, from one mental or psychological state to another. And you want to see rituals, look at your college graduation ceremony, look at church, look at we're surrounded by rituals.
9/11.
9/11, yeah, so there's lots of rituals. But when you look at ritual process, there's 3 components. Separation, which means you're separated from your old self. Now, obviously, if you get your college graduation, you are going through a ritual, and you go through an initiation, which is and then an initiation, and then you go into a return where you come out of that transition. And so you come out as, well, hey, I'm Dr. Hans now. I went through this ritual. All right, buy me a pizza. But basically these are, wedding ceremony, etc. So these are very important, but they have very major psychological effects. And the use of ritual can have very powerful social and individual consequences or things like that. So the first part of ritual is you have a separation, which means you're stepping into a different space than your normal day-to-day existence, whether that's dressing up, putting on your wedding gown, whether that's, putting on your insane clown posse makeup and going to an insane clown posse concert, whether it's an occult ritual, an initiatory ritual, anything like that. So this is something that there's a separation, something that you could say either sometimes it's a shock, sometimes, in Africa, there's certain tribes the young man will have to go and live in the forest by himself and survive. Masonry, they're blinded with the blindfold. So that's a separation phase, right? Where you're being taken out of your normal world. Then there's initiation, where the transformative process is undertaken. And that, again, can relate to just taking your wedding vows, to a whole variety, right? But this is basically where the material is transmitted after setting you up for that. And a lot of times this uses lots of symbols. So it works with a symbolic language as well. There's a symbolic language. There's a processual or performative language also. Ritual is also a performance, right? Ritual and performance come together. And then there's a return, where you return to your day-to-day life. And if the ritual is successful, you've been transformed. If it's a legal ritual, then the transformation is obvious. If it's a wedding ritual, if it's some kind of initiation, it may or may not have that effect. But the use of this ritual process is important, just to keep that in mind as a sort of a guidepost now as we kind of dive into the next direction here. Just going through all the books I'm reading, what's surprising is this stuff is soft-pedaled so much, Like, I just got a biography of Crowley, and in this biography, it's a newer one, and this guy is, going through, actually expanding on the intelligence connections, but he's eulogizing Crowley. He's like, he loves Crowley. It's so positive. It's so, it's strange to see. And even all these other books, they talk about, even I found a mention, it's a strange, it's one of those strange coincidences that even though the Stones knew Kenneth Anger and they had the Altamont concert on the exact same date as this particular ceremony, and there were 3 violent deaths at Altamont, 2 in a car, in a hit-and-run car accident, and Robert Meredith Hunter. That's just one of those strange coincidences. and it might well be. But good.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's like in the last couple of articles I've published, the repeated theme of serendipity.
Yeah, but also, it's something that just to read this literature, because I've gone through, I always try to track my facts. And then, one thing is, a lot of this material I know from teaching courses or whatever, but I kind of like to put my pulse on the literature and stuff. And it's amazing, a lot of the contemporary rock books and how they, it's almost like some of them almost seem like mind control texts, It's like not necessarily mind control texts, but it's almost like the holy writ of this historical epoch, which is surprising with the kid gloves, some of these people were treated with. Not only Crowley, but like Mick Jagger, and how many people just say, he was really disturbed by it and he was this, and it's just odd that, there's so many people that are demonized or marginalized, and why these guys enjoy such a glow of impunity, or just like they have this status, almost like these cultural heroes. Some of them are very good musicians, some of them aren't. But there's really a massaging of these historical events. At the same time, there's a glamorization. So some of these things, which are much more disturbing, become attractive. And I almost started to feel that myself, as I get into some of this stuff. But so if we want to look at rock and the occult, first of all, there's just a massive amount of pictorial evidence. And I can send you some stuff, but if you just start looking at music videos or just clips, there are thousands and thousands of images. Okay, it's just, there's no end to it. And I just picked two example videos, which I think they come at sort of the beginning and the end, right? One is from 1957, which is sort of the impetus, right? Or the gestational phase from the Beat Generation to what would become the counterculture. And then sort of a postmodern thing here, Fin de Siècle America, where, music is available digitally, and so it's not quite as localized and certainly does not have the same cultural impact, but instead has these small little pockets of groups and other things, and it's we'll get into that a bit later. But I can go through that. I think one of the difficulties with the subject is there's so much there that you can just get lost. Okay, I can go through, here's the 500 death metal videos, here's this or that. But I think that it's much more important to go to the deep cornerstones of this, and then the contemporary landscape, which is just extreme now in terms of these types of symbolic manipulations of consciousness. But let's just start out, if you don't mind. You want to run that video of James Franco, and just to show what I'm talking about, that I'm not
Sure, I'll run that here.
So I don't know what everyone thought, but in this video, there are specific photic driving light patterns. We'll get into deeper what this is, but this video itself is structured as an initiatory process, as a ritual process, and it uses specific light and sound and photic driving patterns. And what's interesting, as well as imagery, which we can get into, but it's I would say that compared to Keisha, it's a little more direct.
Oh yeah,
yeah, and just the same artist performed Aleister Crowley's first performance art piece recently, Bartzobub, Invocation of Bartzobub, which is, we'll talk about Crowley's role in using art, music, sound as a way to spread his doctrine. But just to say that this is, it's a subject that, I used to be, I had a brief stint as a metalhead, mullet. I had a
Well, I hope you do send a photo of that for the final edit.
Yeah. But, I did, I guess I'm lucky in that I had some influences. I had, just as a serendipitous experience to throw in there as I was, really into, this is like 13, 14, I really got into all these metal bands. I saw a lot of bands live, and everything. And I was in the library checking out vinyl, and this old guy, actually old hippie guy, came up. He said, "Why you listen to that?" He said, "Check out jazz." He's like, "You want to get far out, listen to jazz." And so he hit me actually listening to jazz music. And so as it took me a while to get into it, but I certainly was into heavy metal. But anyways, the heavy metal is, this is something where, is it just rock and roll rebellion? Is it just an expression? You're gonna upset your family. You're gonna be rebellious. You're gonna be edgy. You're gonna show your anger. You're gonna show your power. You're gonna, do whatever and have, your upside down pentagram and your Baphomet horns, and you're gonna, all these death metal bands and go out in these scenes. But the amount of satanic imagery or occult imagery in the stuff is just mind-boggling. And since, like me, not listening to this stuff for so many years, I look at the new videos and some of these new bands, it's unbelievable. But that being said, how intellectually astute are these musicians? Is this just the example of lowest common denominator, right? Again, the sort of the Christ figure of do what thou wilt rock life, G.G. Allen, this disgusting, horribly self-abusive, tortured, and also violent human being. And his end was something that's embedded in this rebellion, but there's more to the occult side, right? Is there more to this than what all these mainstream books say? Oh, someone's dabbling in it. It's cool. It's really interesting. Well, it's something that if you start to pull the pieces back, you notice major vector points and transitional points that usually come with some particular character showing up in people's lives. Sometimes you find it in a bit more sidereal way in that it's a little more submerged, because a lot of this, basically the books describe around 67, these guys were introduced, a couple of people that were into the, occult thing just showed up, and suddenly both Stones and the Beatles and all these other bands just got into it in a matter of a few months. That's basically how it's framed. They met a few people, say with the Stones, Anita Pallenberg, and then they completely changed their sound and did these pretty complicated albums that were not just like, not just getting in the studio and, Pink Floyd did an album in a week. These are like kind of seminal albums, Satanic's Majesty's Request and Sgt. Pepper's, but to imply that this just happened within a matter of months is a little bit difficult to support, I would say, or maybe not.
Well, and that's the case with the whole Laurel Canyon scene as well. These people met on a Wednesday, and on Thursday they were donated a whole set of brand new instruments, and they had never played before. Friday they learned to play. Saturday they recorded and released the full album.
Yeah, no, it's this mythos almost, and so like I said, as I've gotten into this, I try to approach everything with an open mind, even though it's getting increasingly harder not to just freak out and say, my God, this is it's far more comprehensive. And the thing is that there's one thing with guilt by association, right? I mean, just for myself, I've received government grants. I worked for a USAID associated organization, translating for Tajik people, taking them around to farm sites. So someone could say, well, gee, Hans is associated with USAID, and he got this, he studied, Persian, and he was in Central Asia. And I've had a lot of people that always say I'm like a CIA agent, and it's like, I don't know. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that's not the case. And obviously, after doing these videos, I don't think people will have that sense. But it's important to go to the deeper level of, I think, even with Laurel Canyon book, which, McGowan is an awesome author, and I really, I appreciate what he's done. I did read the original book on Laurel Canyon and the rock scene, which is, kind of the soft pedal version of it. And I think he did a lot of great work. But it's, you do have to look for these deeper webs, so to speak.
Yeah, he doesn't go deep enough. And I would say that, in my opinion, this series we're doing is actually, and I hate to use an occult Masonic term, that I don't know what else to say, or the capstone on what Dave McGowan put out. And, it's taking it so much further. He said, okay, well, what were they doing, et cetera. And, he asked the questions, but he doesn't really take it to the conclusion. And I think, what we're doing here in this series, whatever it ends up being, 5, 6, 20 episodes, whatever, I think is really the meat of what was behind the whole music, psychedelic social revolution of the 60s.
Yeah. Yeah. And even working on this stuff, like I just looked at my article and it should be 20 pages. It's only 10. I've had stuff, I've had weird things happen with my computer. I've been writing and I've had, the spinning wheel of death, on the Mac, the disk, and then just shutting down, like right when I'm doing this very important part. I just opened up my article. Hopefully it's all there because it's about 22 pages and this showed 10 pages. So hopefully I have it here and I'll
make a Mac jab at you. That's what you get for using a Mac,
Yeah, no, you can Mac jab at me. But all I'm saying is that and this is not, this is not, even though we're going into sort of a more outro kind of realm. I mean, I have certainly had things, because I've had stuff, with my computers where it's not just, it's not just a, what do you call it? It's where, I've had my computers turn on by themselves. I've had, things where, where there's, and I've looked, I've traced IP addresses, I've had hacking. So I know enough to, find out what's going on and look at the system stuff. So anyways, I'm saying that I'm getting some pushback a little bit. Even Google search terms. I search something, I bring up an article. I do the exact same search, it's gone. I've had Wikipedia things that I looked at, those being changed within the day. Maybe a coincidence. I hope it is.
Yeah. Well, and usually when I find stuff like that, when I'm researching, I just copy and paste it straight into the brain database so that I have a record of it there,
Yeah. But again, and that's an example of something where that could easily be a coincidence. My Mac might just have been overloaded with my Herculean efforts at Word. That being said, that's an example of, I can't make a case for that. I can say I'm making a speculative claim that's, whatever.
Yeah.
But the stuff that I'm getting into now, and we're going to be talking about, is not speculative. It just depends on how far you want to trace that back. So let's move on here.
All right.
Okay, so we're on number 3 here. So what's interesting is if you look at some of the choice of artists that are taken as the cornerstones or the king of these seminal figures, right, of our American musical landscape, and those who aren't in America, because pretty much the music culture of the world has been drastically impacted by American music. And even in India, where Utpola, where she's from in India now, like death metal is just getting huge out there. It's really weird. Like these styles will come years later, but this American music, its legacy, its impact is immense. And in a sense, if you look at it, it's one of the most mythologized and eulogized musical genres of all time. I mean, I've taught history of jazz, Western classical music, but rock journalism, rock criticism comes with this mantle, right, of this thing, and it's like our generation. This is our generation, or this was the seminal generation. This is when we were free. This is when Americans were really doing something, when people were creative. This is great. Rock and roll is 1950s, where it's enjoy and, it's everyone's having fun and Elvis is there. And, even I know some pretty graphic stuff of what happened at Elvis concerts, which I won't repeat here, but stuff was happening, even including masturbation with, breaking off chair legs and stuff. I mean, there was some crazy stuff going there. But that being said, within this, there's a mythological history. I use the word hagiography, which is the biography of a saint, right? So many of these rock biographies, they're hagiographies. They are biographies of a saint, where the saint goes here, the saint goes there. The saint has this experience. Anyways, so when you look at rock history, and this is something in the university curriculums, I'll probably, hopefully, if I'm teaching again, they watch this movie, they may not let me teach history of rock, but maybe I think they should let me teach it, actually.
Well, and hopefully, students of this stuff start picking this up and studying this series because, we're laying it all out here.
Yeah. So anyways, one of as I, researching again, and even I always want to check my facts, come up with ideas. So you look at history of rock, you've got some important elements. You don't really have this with the history of jazz. You don't have this with Western classical music. You have giants of classical music, but you don't have this mythology. And the musicians, they're comprehensive biographies, warts and all. In fact, sometimes they're overly critical biographies. And someone like Adorno just ripped into Wagner. Like he hated Wagner with a passion and really described him as, the reification process of capitalism through the leitmotif as this industrial production, bringing this phantasmagoric world of, post-archaic Germanism, blah, blah, blah. And you can write that about Wagner, but try to write that about Mick Jagger. Try to write that about this whole mythology. So I'm just going to mention two artists, Robert Johnson. Okay, Robert Johnson, anyone seen the movie Crossroads? Crossroads film is, have you seen that?
I may have. It sounds familiar.
Crossroads was actually a big influence on me when I started playing guitar. And Crossroads is based, Ralph Macchio is this guy who basically has to battle the devil. It's based on the story of Robert Johnson. And so, the selling the soul to the devil and all this stuff. And it came out, I was a kid, probably a teenager or something. But so, and at the end of the movie, Steve Vai playing the devil versus Ralph Macchio. Ralph Macchio wins, but it's pretty interesting. And this exemplifies the mythos of Robert Johnson. And I mentioned that movie, maybe throw a little clip of that. But that's an example of, you could say, pre and post framing, cultural framing, so to speak, and also culturally encoding messages and narratives. And so we're looking at narrative process, and that's a whole other subject. And I've written a lot about narrative, and I found some Defense Department stuff that's kind of used in some of my modeling. Maybe they probably came up. I'm sure it's not. I'm not claiming that at all, but I'm just saying that people are using this stuff, human intelligence and this kind of thing. And so basically, Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues. Now, why Robert Johnson? There's a lot of amazing Delta Blues guitarists, hundreds, thousands, right, that are recorded, Bucka White, et cetera, et cetera. Reverend Gary Davis, that's an example of a phenomenal blues guitarist, country blues guitarist. There are so many. Robert Johnson was a guitar virtuoso. He wrote amazing songs. But, there are many, many other great blues legends. And the choice of Robert Johnson, and to be honest, I'll just give my basic opinion. I never really got the Robert Johnson thing. I love his music. It's very powerful. But I put on like a Bucka White recording, or I put on, Reverend Gary Davis. I felt that it really impacted me.
Sure.
Robert Johnson, I always said, Keith Richards says this is the greatest guitarist.
Very much. I mean, I'd definitely go with your choice on Robert there. The most prolific and the most sensitive blues playing I've ever heard.
Eric Clapton, of course, playing the song Crossroads. Etc., all across the board. And he's considered to be, any book on rock and roll, any documentary film is usually going to start with Robert Johnson. What about Robert Johnson? Well, he was a blues guitarist that basically, for just to be a bit blunt, absolutely sucked. And so Willie Dixon, I think it was hopefully Willie Dixon, but it's one of his friends, wrote about Robert Johnson. He would come in to play, and people would actually hate it so much that they would either leave, they'd make him stop playing. He was the worst musician. I mean, he was like, just every level. He was so bad he would clear a room. Okay. And then Robert Johnson went away. Okay. He went away, 69 Highway, Clarksdale. I think it was Clarksdale, Mississippi. But Robert Johnson the mythos goes, and what he admitted, he went to a crossroads, because the crossroads, at midnight is supposed to be a place where, you can meet Satan, or you can meet this thing. And supposedly he went and sold his soul to the devil. He came back and was a flat out amazing virtuoso guitarist. They said he never practiced. They said he could just pick up a guitar and play anything, and he would just write songs off the drop of his hat. And he recorded, the 78 RPM songs, and those have really become canonical in rock music. You find many, many covers throughout history. But Robert Johnson is considered to be the progenitor of rock, right? He's the grandfather, so to speak, which is interesting. Again, I'm just mentioning that as a choice, but certainly he was associated with selling his soul to the devil. Many of his songs, Gotta Keep Moving, Hellhound on My Trail. He talks about, I'm going to beat my woman till I get satisfied. He has all these songs about the devil, including Crossroads. And he died. He was shot. He was shot by his wife or something, and he was basically killed. But I said, again, he's a good artist, but there's a lot of better artists that are much more obscure. But all these guys cited him, and all the textbooks cite him. And that's just an interesting thing. Another guy is Uncle Dave Mason, who's like sort of considered to have done one of the most ecstatic pieces of music. It's sort of like a jug band, real early time music around the same era. And he was chosen by, to be sort of by Harry Smith, which we'll talk about in a bit, on this very interesting anthology of American folk music, which is an extremely powerful document. And I'll show it's not just a bunch of records, but it's an example of somebody who has this wonderful, ecstatic song, and in the middle of it, it's like this, it's considered to be one of the most exuberant, high-powered songs ever, right? And in the middle of it, he says, kill yourself, go kill yourself. In the middle of the song, almost like a message when people reach this state of they're really enjoying life and dancing and everything, and he puts this message in there in a very positive way. Kind of a weird thing that this energy of this thing is associated with certain types of messaging, right? So you can play the blues, and the blues was often known as the devil's music or church music, but in the black community, the African American community, blues was a different. It connected with the church music. There was some emblems of this. There was a lot of, sometimes references. The devil, P.D. Wheatstraw. There's all kinds of guys like that. But the fact is that Robert Johnson was one of the few people that was actually considered to directly have a major satanic influence. Okay, so and then just to call to mind also when we talked about the Princeton Radio Project, we look at these interlocking media productions, right? So you look at some of these important films. If you look at both things coming before and after, you do have to, when you're dealing with the phenomena of mass culture, keep in mind that this was studied and was studied in great detail with many, many sub-projects at many universities with millions and millions of dollars of funding. And not only looking at music per se, but again, looking at the entire, you could say the environment, the media environment how it molds the individual, right? How the individual is molded by their environment. And also to understand that, I'm not going to, make, until I give, more research to it, but it's important to note a lot of the film productions that are associated, even things that were unpopular, sometimes especially things that were relatively obscure and unpopular, that are connected with other historical events or other types of mythologization, and et cetera. So the movie Crossroads and Robert Johnson, if everyone watches that movie, they'll get a sense of what I'm talking about, in that this is creating this narrative of rock, and this is the peak of heavy metal. This movie came out when the guitar was really at its peak of being the most popular instrument, and so for a kid who's into music, it's going to be very influential. Even my friend was talking about going down, there's a graveyard, near where I grew up. He went down there thinking about taking his guitar down there, 14 years old, at midnight, like Robert Johnson, so he could, play music. And the thing is, when you're young, you don't know this stuff. It just seems almost like, it's fun, and maybe it is fun, but right. Jan, you have anything? Throw in there.
No, I'm just listening. So, yeah. And speaking of the Princeton Radio Project, there's a whole other vast area of research there that we'd like to get going on as well.
Yeah, no, certainly, and that's something that I think is really important to pull that stuff out because, and a lot of this research I've had to go back. I've done many centuries of research. There's a lot of stuff you're going to find around the 1890s, 1810 that will connect with this. That's what's really kind of been blowing my mind, and there's no sense of anywhere trying to cobble together facts to put together some kind of a thing. It's more like you start following it, then you pull one knot apart, it all interconnects. But again, that being said, the study of this, during the same around 1939, and then you look at these media events and how all these things are timed, it's possible to ascertain patterns. And sometimes I think I will try to make a case for at least a few of these things being perhaps pre-designed in a certain way. But anyways, the mythology, the history, the culture, the cult of rock has, if you look at the two pillars, I would say the founding fathers in a certain way are, Aleister Crowley and Robert Johnson. Okay. And
interesting terms, two pillars.
Yeah. And that very much is part of it to a certain extent, in that to understand what's going on right now, like if I want to sit down and go through frame by frame, a Beyonce video or whatever, or the James Franco thing you guys watched, that's going to take me a long time. And it's not just some generic imagery, devil horns and, some pentagrams and some like horror movie stuff. There's extremely deep levels of stuff that you have to go pretty far back to find out where they're from, into, some of the Rosicrucian orders, into Theophilosophical Society, the Anthrophilosophical Society, Golden Dawn, but not so much the Golden Dawn as, the Great White Brotherhood, all kinds of these different organizations, the Carbonari, all kinds of stuff starts to link in with this if you want to actually pull apart the symbolism. So that being just that, hopefully will give some weight to what we'll discuss here shortly, because, the average person is not going to, I wouldn't have spent this much time going into this material if I wasn't doing this research. And some of it is very hard to come by, some of this material. You have to get a lot of these out of print books. And you find that a lot of the more recent publications is just kind of dumbed down or sort of whitewashed or very superficial understanding of what's happening. You know what I mean? So you really get this, I'd say there's like a breathless tone, kind of a breathless, or else you get this kind of a leaden conspiracy, and then you suddenly prescribe this, Theodore Adorno wrote the lyrics for the Beatles. That's an example of just a ridiculous piece of information, and the Committee of 300, which may be there, but then you get these sort of arcane groups, and then there you go, it's the Masons, don't think about it. And in fact, you do have to do a lot more research.
Right, and apparently Coleman was intentional disinformation.
Yeah. So my argument as we go forward here is that when we look at the entire landscape of the 20th century, as it's been utilized in its entirety, from the turn of the century till, even the present day, this is all material for this construction, so to speak, for this manifestation of, I would have to say, a incredibly well planned out and very intelligently deployed mass process of induction, of cultural transformation, and also of some other, a deeper agenda, which we're going to touch on today. But this, and
I was just going to say, and it's a mass induction into, it appears to be Satanism.
Yeah, well, I think it's much more than Satanism. That's what really started to kind of give me serious pause. But So let's so we've seen that music video, and now if we look at, as I said in the beginning, this all ties into the first part, right, of this. This is almost more like a course, so to speak, than just a talk. But so the same thing is, just for this one aspect, all those 8 aspects of music and mind control can apply to this one segment, right? So so what you see, though, in this unfolding, in this deployment of music, or in a lot of times you could say the natural processes that occurred, have been and are part of a massive, massive wave of cultural transformation that and it does have subterranean roots. So below the surface, there's a lot more there. And sometimes there's a lot on the surface. So, again, we'll get into this and how this works, but we talk about Aleister Crowley. Why is he so important? Aleister Crowley is truly a seminal figure in, I realize now, he probably had more impact on our contemporary culture than almost anybody. Or you could say what he was doing, which did not start with him and continued through him. But he is someone that really exemplifies, and it's odd, again, it's odd, okay, to me, that this guy became such an important figure in the 60s counterculture, when the fact was that by the time he died, some years after his death, his fans got together and ate some curry in an Indian restaurant. He was basically he was forgotten. He would have been a totally marginalized figure in history. He did not have much influence at that time. But Crowley used ritual and this performance process to induce people and he also used music, and he used art and theater to a certain extent, but he formulated this as an example of a way to manifest his aims. And the thing is that's a little bit odd, is that you see so many examples of this coming through on multiple fields and multiple planes of society. And I just don't know why people don't have the cojones or think he's such a great person. But anyways, there's a description, which actually I don't have off to send you the text, but there's a very interesting article that came up describing one of Crowley's sort of musical performances. And in this, they were given a chalice to ingest wine mixed with peyote, right? And he was applying ceremonial magic to musical performance and using the setting of the theater, the setting of the space of art, right? That meaning, if you sit down in front of a TV, I'm here to be entertained. You buy tickets to an event, you're going to be entertained. You don't necessarily expect you're going to be part of a ritual process. And that's exactly what Crowley did. And this quote, which I will dig up, describes the way the women are dancing around in frenzy. Almost sounds like, basically sounds like a Grateful Dead show, is exactly what it sounds like.
Or Woodstock.
Or Woodstock, yeah, exactly. And so...
Did you, by chance, see that short documentary I sent you yesterday called The Rave New World?
No, I didn't, man. Sorry, I didn't get a chance. I would love to.
Yeah, and I'm going to edit in a clip of that video as well. And what they do is they show in this video the ancient tribal dancing rituals, and then they show modern dance rituals. They show, compare it to Satanism and all of this stuff, and it goes back and forth and just shows you the correlations between the ancient tribal music. It definitely plays into the whole neo-feudalism thing, and a lot more as well.
I am useless. Give me my arm. There be hallucinogens and
have devised a method of combining music, hypnotism, and Pavlovianism to nerve jam the children of our nation
and use you open
group shamanic experience, and it's becoming very, very popular in Europe and this country.
Totally.
Is a pursuit of the wind, and a mechanic plan is to lead you away from that comfort.
Oh yeah, and that's one thing too, that the level that like I said, I'm not going to get into that material today, and I'm just still trying to digest it. So I just want to let people know that even what I'm talking about today it goes much deeper than that, to the point where I had to like stop and say, did I read that? Is that really? Yes. So, and you're exactly right. That what you mentioned in that video is exactly what it's connected to. And this is now what I'm uncovering, and we're uncovering too in concert, is that, and this is not just Satanism, it's not just Crowley. It is something that, there's a musical cult in Russia in the 1814, 1815, and you look about all this stuff. And so, and you can see this stuff moving forward and being brought in and out of the public consciousness. But the one thing that I want to stress that's fundamentally different is what I would describe as the involuntary initiation ceremony, or the public initiation ceremony, or the public ritual process where you're taking a lot of times these types of groups would be extremely secretive. In fact, most of the time, right? Because you could, some places you could be killed for practicing these things. But these were very secretive practices. They were associated, you look at the Eleusinian mystery cults, Egypt, it's a very big topic. But the fact is that these were either done in a very strict religious setting. A lot of times they were done, especially in the Western world, especially post-Christianity, in a very secretive way. And all these secret societies, all these groups, and they are legion, and they certainly exist. I mean, I don't know if they exist now, but they exist historically, and there's reams of documentary evidence that people voluntarily entered these organizations. And there was a process of gradually going through certain stages of continued initiations, continued processes, which by and large, would transform the individual. And only if someone proved capable or proved malleable enough, or proved amoral enough, or proved well-connected enough, would they move to these higher stages. And secrecy was punishable by death. And there's lots of examples of that. And so, but what's very different from the 50s onward, on a large scale, is we have some of these events occurring, or associated material being released to the public, but also being induced upon the public in a, by and large, subconscious way. And that is something that does indicate. Now, whether or not, I'm not claiming, these people are all powerful, but I hopefully I can make the case in this, and perhaps if we continue, that there's certainly a conscious effort, and it's 100% it's being done. I would say there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that exactly these things are being deployed, employed, and are more and more increasingly out in the open. And we didn't have a time to talk about symbolism and how symbols affect the mind. But the fact is that symbols do, in your mind, in a sense, you kind of draw, if you look at a symbolic form, that does affect your visual, cortex and stuff like that. But the use of symbols and their effect and resonance on the human consciousness has been, well studied, for a long time. So let me just give a quote from Crowley. We'll get into more of this later.
Sure.
But this is after his first experimentation with this new concept of performing the ritual, right? Of you turning it into a musical event, like a concert, but it's a dual process. So this is what he said about it. This is from his Confessions. Here, in the use of a person as a material basis to invoke the spirit, was a startling innovation in tradition. I wrote, moreover, a ritual on entirely new principles. I retained the Kabbalistic names and formulae, but wrote most of the invocation in poetry. The idea was to work up the magical enthusiasm through exhilaration induced by music. Okay, that's Invocation of Beelzebub, which was recently, you can watch a music video of James Franco doing this exact same crawling ritual right now. So, but this was his sort of discovery. And that's what I want to say that I am sort of jumping ahead and sort of making my conclusion here before I present the evidence, but just want people to keep that in mind that's hopefully I can draw that picture and we'll see. And again, it's not just a mono monaural signal, but it's a highly complex, if you look at it as a waveform pattern, it's an extremely complex waveform pattern with many, many different nodal points.
All right.
Okay.
Did you want to start getting into the surface with Crowleyan ritual and description?
Yeah. Well, so Crowley believed that art is magic and magic is art. And so magic is spelled M-A-G-I-C-K. And magic, this is distinguishable from, well, he used this term to be a little bit cool, but also to distinguish this from trickery or some types of fakery to actual having effect on the material world. So the whole point of magic was to induce direct changes either on your mind, on the mind of another, influence material reality, and the whole point was to have some empirical verification. So he did approach this very much scientifically, in that he was looking for these specific results. He was conducting experiments, so even though he was we'll get into his bio in a bit, but even though he was pretty much a fully documented agent, but on and off. So he was kind of a part-time agent for MI6 and perhaps other intelligence organizations. And there's now absolutely no question from declassified documents. And he was involved in a lot of important stuff. But he also was, he's probably one of those, you think of like Jason Bourne or something who's like, going out and, losing his memory and doing something, then he'll get a call and suddenly swing back into action. So there were periods of Crowley's life where he was kind of destitute, where he, was, completely messed up on, tremendous amounts of drugs and all the other, massive orgiastic sex addiction that he did, that he was just a burnout. At the same time, there's times when he was brought into major important centers of political power and was passing information, was spying and all stuff like that. But the fact is, Crowley had the perfect cover. You want to think of a better cover than, the most debased individual known publicly in the world, which, he certainly was. But so the Crowleyan ritual, which I'll get into more detail, art is magic and magic is art. And the idea is to induce psychophysiological transformations in the participant in this ritual, in this event. And when he discovered that, or he believed that, he this new methodology of employing performance, right? So and again, do you understood? I mean, a lot of these ceremonial magic stuff and these kind of secret societies, I mean, you would never get to experience this at that time. You would never, even for hundreds of years. I mean, if you saw this thing and you were not invited and you wrote about it, you could end up, with your house burned down and things like that. So, so basically, this is idea of revelation of the method, which is a sort of a concept you find in Freemasonry, which I've mentioned before. But revelation of the method is something where at a late stage of the social transformation, and we find in all of these sort of occult mystery schools, or most of them, one of their major agendas is world transformation. It's not just Theophilosophical Society, all these groups. Crowley wanted to transform the government, the world, the social structure, everything. Judeo-Krishnamurti, across the board. I can keep going and going with that. But so it's not just they're doing this stuff so they can have these ecstatic states or support their religion, but they actually talk about how to completely transform the entire social, economic, religious, everything.
Sure. Well, it's basically sophism to manipulate the social construct.
Well, I don't think it's sophism. I think that I think that to the best of their ability, some of these people have employed these means. And that's when I talk about a revelation of the method, in that, so again, with Crowley and with, when we get into later occult rock, what we have is him taking these, so to speak, secret magical ceremonies, which again work as induction processes to those who become part of the group. So the group, they are being mentally transformed as the addict.
Sure, but then that transformation of that group then goes out into the world and affects whatever change or whatever Altamont. It has that effect on the world because people are seeing that, like 9/11, etc.
Well, that's what I mean by revelation of the method. So we first see this with Crowley, where he is taking these rituals and these, sacred formula, and stuff like that, and doing it with music, selling tickets, giving people wine and peyote, right? Sure. And that this is where, and he describes this as the way to bring out the new aeon, the third aeon, the aeon of Horus. And that was his life's work, was the fundamental transformation of society through breaking all the barriers about sex, promoting the use of drugs, through destroying Christianity. Does that sound familiar?
Absolutely.
And so what I'm saying is that the levels, I'm sort of jumping ahead here a little bit, but the levels of these societies, right, are such that, there a lot of times they're like sort of world transformational objectives will not be publicly talked about, or if they do, they're framed in a very benign way.
Sure.
And one thing to notice too is that Crowley talked about love. We wanted to bring love and peace through will. And we'll talk about what the will is a bit later, because that's very interesting.
All right, well, let's get to Harry Smith. And we're already almost at 2 hours here, and we're not even to the level 2 here.
Yeah, we'll keep going, and then we can, actually, Jan, I was going to say, you could split that first one off as a separate thing. But so Harry Smith in the Anthology of American Folk Music is a very interesting example of what I was just talking about. Now, and by the way, and there is a lot of sophistry, but just to give you an example, I mean, something like Marxism, which has a stated plan of world revolution, these plans were implemented, right? They weren't just armchair. I mean,
well, absolutely, and and many Marxists have stated that it's no different than Zionism, and we see this promotion through Zionism and through Israel as well. So it does have an effect on the world, but it's done through, in my opinion, and it's done through lies, manipulation, sophistry, ritual to nudge people along in the direction by making something that 80 years ago would have caused public riots, making it totally norm today.
Yeah, but also inducing the riots. And we talk about Stravinsky and Stravinsky, Rites of Spring, etc. But and I just want to clarify that one point is that, something like Zionism per se is not, at least a state objective, is mostly to establish a state, not at least surfacely to do something to establish a one world government. But
well, I think somewhere I have a document. I may have lost it. I've looked for it a couple times, but on my computer someplace I have a document that shows several dozens of Israeli political leaders stating that Zionism is no different whatsoever than communism.
Okay, well, yeah, that's and so you have these organizations, and a lot of times though, what you have is this framing, right? So we notice through the whole thing it's being framed in a certain way. So if you look at the peace and love rhetoric, we can change the world. Peace and love, good vibrations. Even Crowley, his literature. I've read some of his pamphlets that he distributed to attract new followers. It's very much put in very positive, kind of glowing terms in terms of what's going to happen to you, in terms of how you're going to, embrace these positive things. You're going to help bring about a new world of love, blah, blah, blah. So these things, there's a major portion of the framing of this. But let's shift to Harry Smith. And Harry Smith released an extremely interesting and possibly important collection of music, right, known as the Anthology of American Folk Music. And normally you'd think, that's just, these are these rock guys, getting together and they discover this wonderful collection of music. And they're getting, with all their roots and all this stuff. But it's a very, very, very fascinating document. And before we do that, can you roll that clip of Harry Smith that I sent? He also was an experimental filmmaker, just so people can get a sense of the output of this guy who put together such a seminal record.
Absolutely. Play that here.
Okay, so I hope you guys like that. So hopefully you might get a sense that this guy is not just a musicologist, which he was, but he also had some other interests, including experimental film. And, and his experimental film is considered to be, he's a great experimental filmmaker. You might think of Monty Python and even like Yellow Submarine, some of his animation techniques, which is all done by hand, was put in there. But the Anthology of American Folk Music, and I talked a little about this whole cantometrics, and we can probably tie that in with this too. Oh, actually, that would be wild, to tie this in with Alan Lomax's cantometric system of classifying music as it works for specific cultural groupings. Because it was done around the same time. That's something I have to look into. But basically, the Anthology of American Folk Music was a collection of a lot of American artists, and this is something that had been released. So this is something, the Anthology of American Folk Music, you get kind of like a farmer's almanac of music, where you're going to get these music will be released. And it's through. Smithsonian, I think, or Folkways. Smithsonian
Folkways. Yeah, right.
Smithsonian Folkways. And so, a lot of these things are just going to go on library shelves, right? I mean, I've got Folkways recordings, but like Alan Lomax, who I already mentioned, was a major archiver, recording lots and lots of musicians, traveling around the Deep South, etc. So, but what he did, Smith basically redid this entire collection. And he redid it in a very, very interesting way. Okay, and I don't know if you can put in some images of this particular collection.
Sure.
But basically, he started to change what the songs were, and he started to put the songs, he said, in a very specific order, based on almost a type of alchemical suggestion. Basically, he has a picture of Robert Flood's monochord. So he's literally employing this idea of principle of alchemy, and he has much said so himself with this release. And a little about Harry Smith, he was a pretty wild guy. He was kind of very antisocial. He was very much connected with very bohemian lifestyles. He himself said he was the illegitimate son of Aleister Crowley, which is an interesting little aside there. But he... by the end of his life, he was a resident shaman at the Naropa Institute. And
we did I did a show with Professor Jay Fikes and Lydia and Royce Whitecalf regarding the Naropa Institute and their involvement in all of this stuff already. So,
yeah. And, hopefully they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So hopefully that little video clip, and think about that in 1957 and what that relates to. And you want to sit down and break down all that symbolism. But that shows, and there's a Kenneth Anger film that basically almost looks like the hippie subculture, and that's done around the same time, sort of latter half of the 50s. But what he said on receiving his Grammy, he got a Grammy Award in 1991, and he said, quote, "I'm glad to say my dreams came true. I saw America changed by music." And that was his stated objective in putting together this Folkways collection. There's very odd choice of songs, and there's a use of a lot of very there's a quote from Bob Dylan. I'll have to dig it up, but Bob Dylan, to paraphrase, says, the Folkways collection introduced me to an American, of the vagabonds, of the thieves, of the whores, of the murderers, of the the dark voodoo, whatever. And this is the America, the real America, right? So this Folkways collection presented a specific vision of music in America with songs in very chosen orders. He spent a lot of time choosing the song orders with a very surrealistic booklet. So, and it has a nice inscription, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," right there in the book, right there in the record booklet. And he talks about using 4 elements. So each one of the records is based on one of the 4 elements, and this idea of sort of an alchemical transformation, again, with the monochord. And so he very explicitly states that this is his agenda for this project. And a lot of songs with supernatural. I mean, there's other songs too, but he looked at the ability of the musicians to present themselves as bodies, that is, as these living kind of visceral beings, as damned, as hate-filled, as joyous, as whatever. But it was very intense music that represented a sort of a new vision of America that was not like the earlier collections, and in a sense was a rewriting of American musical history in a very prestigious form, right? So it is kind of odd. You think of much more of an intellectual or academic publication house. This is not, RCA or some psychedelic record label. This is the Smithsonian. And with the text itself has all these weird newspaper clippings, like about someone drowned here, and then the whole book of itself of the albums is very odd. So the whole thing, he envisioned this as almost as a ritual itself. The records, the entire thing embodies almost a ritual document or a magical document based on Crowleyan techniques and technology, who, again, Harry Smith aligned himself with, claimed that Crowley was his father. He was an illegitimate child of Crowley, as did Graham Bond, the English bluesman and occultist, acid casualty in the 60s. So that's out there. We could go more detail into that, but we'll just continue on from there. But that's something that when I look into this, I'm just giving some of the points here that show that that there is some deliberation. Now, certainly one can make an argument that this whole occult stuff or these magic with the K is just bullshit. It's just mind control stuff. And there's a great degree of truth in that. A lot of times, we get more into these secret societies. People are induced, and they have to release their will. They have to learn to diminish their critical thinking to allow the channeling of the masters, the channeling of the guardian angel that Crowley communicated with as he was being sodomized in the African desert. That's a hilarious story. Sorry, but so this idea. But on the other hand, I want to say that I'm not making a claim that there is some power, but rituals have immense power, and America was transformed. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying this was a causal factor, but I'm saying that this occult aspect is there whether or not, it actually had an effect in the space-time world as Crowley intended it to is debatable. But certainly the attempt in an extremely well-organized and complex attempt.
Well, it's definitely had a psychological effect on the masses, period, which then, of course, would affect change in society and the world, from that standpoint, irregardless of if there is actual magic, whoever is arguing the actual magic perspective, I guess I would have to see the onus of proof for that.
But you see, you also have to understand how we define magic, right? So NLP technology is a type of magic,
right? But it's sophism. It's using trickery. It's
sophism, but it's also, there are some good points to NLP, that being aware of your representational systems, right? So you're clarifying, this is for the NLP operator, not necessarily for the NLP, patient or one being operated on, but being aware of your sensory modality. Internal, external sensory modality of hearing, sight, talent, kinesthetic. So being very clear about these representational systems and what they mean. Because if you have a blank spot, right? If you're in a certain, for example, say you're in a state of ecstasy, at the rave, and you are not really aware of these other sort of perceptual modalities, you can entrain and put a vast amount of information into those vector points, so to speak. At the same time, the magic, has, I would say that, my opinion is that rituals can be very powerful. It is possible that things can be done that may indeed have some effects outside what would, necessarily be materially apparent, and that maybe have a psychological basis. It may not. I don't really have an answer for that, but I do think that the people doing this 100% believe that it does, or else they wouldn't be investing so much in it. I think that there is a degree of sophistry. There's a great degree of sophistry, but there also is a belief in some of these deeper level practitioners that this stuff does work. And a lot of times a lot of people have been driven absolutely insane by it. But back to, and again, that's a very interesting point though. And we could, don't really have an opinion on that, but I'm just saying that considering there's been so much effort in that direction, it may be interesting to see, there may be some experiments based on, these psychological entrainment factors and group, mind stuff that relates to that. But anyways,
there's a quote here, and I'm just pulling it up from Aldous Huxley, and let me just get it up here. He says, meanwhile, we have been looking into Dianetics. Basically, it seems to be a procedure by which one obtains age regression without putting the patient into deep hypnosis. The aim is to get at the words and phrases heard by the patient at moments of lowered consciousness. Music would do that, as well as the the whole audio visual thing, and accepted by him as obsessive commands, like post-hypnotic suggestions. The subconscious seems to take these verbal commands literally and unreasoningly, without regard to context. The result can be disastrous both mentally and physically. If this is really the case, we may have here the rationale of magic spells, curses, anathemas, and the like.
Yeah, exactly. And, at the same time, there is a profoundly psychological effect, again, in revelation of the method, just getting back to that briefly, when, in terms of, say, you have a mass ritual where you also reveal, in a sense, you show what you're doing, but then but not, so if someone looks at it closely, you're showing very blatantly what you're doing, but at the same time, the people that are the dupes, the mind-controlled masses, the unconscious participants are not aware of that, but it's right there in your face.
Right. Well, and that's the idea, though. It's like Huxley says here. It's to get at the subconscious there, to take these verbal commands literally and unreasonably, so they can do this ritual. Let's say at Altamont or whatever, or let's say 9/11, pick one you wish, and then all of the people who aren't aware of that ritual are then going to, take whatever commands, at Altamont, whatever Mick Jagger is singing there, etc., and, go out into the world from there and then implement those subconscious, obsessive commands.
Yeah, certainly. But also see the revelation of the method. I was looking at, the Theophilosophical Society. And so that's, and that's not maybe one of the more sinister groups. They have Fabian Society connections, etc. I won't go into their whole history in detail, but it's very interesting. You look at Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was viewed as the coming Christ, right? The new avatar.
Well, he worked, again, this is somebody who worked very closely with Aldous Huxley, and he was all about getting people to not think.
Exactly. And Ledbetter, H.D. Ledbetter was these, theophilosophical, kind of a mainstay. You have Blavatsky. Again, this is huge. Every one of these directions goes on. But Ledbetter raised Krishnamurti. There was another world incarnation that was supposed to be like reincarnation of Plato or Pythagoras or something. And his parent, there were some allegations that Mr. Ledbetter was having some sneaky fingers, if you know what I mean. He was doing a little bit inappropriate action with these kids that he was raising. So their parents withdrew the Messiah and took their kids back to their family, and there was some scandal and some newspaper articles about that. But he raised Jiddu Krishnamurti and his brother, who also died sort of mysteriously. But Krishnamurti was raised in this setting, but I saw the exact same thing where Krishnamurti, would say he'd become filled with the voice of the master. He would, they'd been talking about this for, a couple decades. He was, they had these groups of children known as the Round Table. Right, these kids were trained for to be like knights supporting, Jiddu Krishnamurti. They had their own, they wear armor and all this stuff. They had all these little spin-off kids organizations. But Krishnamurti, again, was seen as this, he's the savior. He is the coming Christ. He's the coming Maitreya. And so, and if you look at actually what's really great is there's a journalist that went to one of his speeches in the camp they stayed at. I think it was in California or probably in India. And he talks about how all the people, he said, everyone was very much, there's all these rules and regulations. You weren't that free. It was a very sort of oppressive environment. At the same time, it was supposedly very free, but there was lots of, backbiting. And he mentioned, the fact that women were walking around, in their undergarments, and all this stuff. And I'll get into that more detail, but at that event, Krishnamurti, after saying, the one, people are induced in this hypnotic state. They're getting very powerful experiences. When they're seeing him, people describe seeing lights in the sky, and this physicist describes seeing this, giant meteorite flash over, when Krishnamurti spoke, because they're getting that experience. And so Krishnamurti talks, the world teacher, you must give up everything and follow, and you'll embrace love and life and this. And then the next thing he says, you cannot follow me. You cannot believe in anything. You cannot have any code or creed. I may be confused. I may be misleading you. Find your own leaders. I'll give you this exact quote. I'm paraphrasing. But find your own way. I am not the master. There is no master. You must become the master. Then back to the channeled invoked voice of a master with his probably Ledbetter's training of Krishnamurti, who raised him, and then same thing, you have that embedded, there's a revelation of the method. He's full of crap.
Yeah, and just some of Jiddu Krishnamurti's background, he's heavily involved in Theosophy, which of course Annie Besant and all the others, Madame Blavatsky, but he's also heavily influenced by perennial philosophy and perennial tradition, perennial philosophy created by Aldous Huxley. And we go up to perennial tradition, and that ties directly into the Hermetic tradition.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the Hermetic tradition also.
But what I want to say though is we should probably break after this little segment here before we go into the next part and make the rest of the outline for this lecture. Lecture 5.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. In fact, we can just go. So it's yeah. So anyways, but
is that all right? You look a little disappointed on that.
No. I'm just thinking about material. So, but I wanted to say is that what happened with the thousands of followers around the world who believed in Krishnamurti as the new Messiah in the flesh, Christ on earth, the great guru. And they had given their lives, their fortunes, everything. They had done all these exercises. They had sacrificed their entire lives. And then suddenly Krishnamurti, he quit and said, I'm dissolving the Order of the East. I'm dissolving this. I quit. You're on your own. And then he became this spiritual teacher that everyone knows. Because most people don't know much about his early history. And then he became, use your choiceless awareness, and I won't go into that. Exact same thing happened in the 60s. A carpet was pulled out from other people, right? They're believing in stuff. They have all this positive energy. We can change the world. And they felt, a lot of people felt it with their hearts. I mean, they really felt everything was there. They had this idealism. Boom. Crushed, taken away. Same process, different, but obviously much more complex when we look at music. So, yeah, and I think we could just stop there, and I can start with point 3 in the next segment.
Excellent, and thank you so much, Hans. And so obviously we'll be doing part 5, and we'll probably need a part 6 at this point too, because I do want to also do one just entering all of these people into the brain database with you.
Yeah, great, Jan. Well, that's one thing is that, I try to be bullet point about it, but it's kind of like all these connections and
too much.
You can't, and the thing is, a lot of the stuff that is kind of bullet point, you don't start being able to draw these pieces together, and they become. So the whole idea is to give people ability to really grapple with this in a solid way, to see these interconnections, which is when you see disjointed things. Just briefly, if you just look at, say, music, if you're a devout Christian and you see satanic stuff in rock and realize that it is a major part of the rock agenda, you may completely, lose it. I mean, it may cause a mental breakdown if you're a big rock fan, or it may cause something else. It may not bother you, but the thing is that if you put it in context with all these other things, then you can take this one piece and see how it plays out in the larger structures, at the same time developing your logic and critical reasoning.
Well, and our goal is to help people be aware of this information, because they are being duped and mind controlled. It doesn't matter if you were involved in, just the psychedelic aspect of MK Ultra, if you were part of the music and any of the music, if it was the jazz or the rock or, whatever, you're probably caught up in it. And you talked about the Chinese emperors changing the tone of the instruments with each new empire, etc. So, this stuff has obviously been used, music has been used for mind control for a very long time. You want to add anything, wrap it up for part 4?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Plato, as Plato said, when music modes change, the fundamental laws of the state change with them. Okay. And and just to say, it's not, I do want to emphasize that there is a lot of, there's a lot of jazz. It's very good. It's very uplifting and very positive. Just very briefly, primarily with jazz, that's an example of where certain drugs were introduced into the jazz scene. Not necessarily the music itself, but the lifestyle that went along with it. So what you have there is, and we can talk about that later, but but now obviously you listen to jazz, you don't have to, be like Charlie Parker shooting up in the basement. But there are when you look at these big major nodal vectors, these major points, and then you can start to trace and see how one person can have this huge ripple effect, and other people are maybe outside of these streams, and aren't necessarily caught up in that. But a lot of times those people are going to be marginalized, or you're going to find a lot more criticism or a lot more disinfo about them, as opposed to some people that are treated like these, great gurus, life-changing, cultural heroes, which is in some cases pretty pathetic when you look at what their lives actually consisted of. But Jan, real pleasure, man, and we'll just keep rolling here for the next part. So,
all right.